Let's look at the issue of nutrition now. Malnutrition remains one of the huge concerns in the country. A recent survey by the Human Sciences Research Council revealed that over 63% of South African households face food insecurity. So how do we deal with the protein insecurity as well in the country? Kentse Radebe is the Deputy CEO at DG Murray Trust and joins us live now. Kentse, thank you so much for your time and good evening to you. Let's start with understanding the nutritional divide. Is it about an issue of food insecurity only, or even access to food, or is there something deeper going on here?
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. I think there's a couple that are happening in South Africa right now. And I think even the previous segment that you showed really outlines the socioeconomic challenges that South Africans and households across the country are facing. And over the last 2 years, and even during the pandemic, we've seen the crisis of food affordability. So yes, on the one hand, it is about access, but I also think on the other hand, it is about affordability. So we know that currently in South Africa, 1 in 5 households are food insecure. This means that they're not eating enough meals a day. And we know that this is particularly exacerbated for households that are earning lower incomes, where there are higher unemployment rates, and just poorer households generally. And we've seen how the rising costs of the food basket compared to GDP growth and everything else actually is in contradiction. So what that means is that individuals, families, and children, importantly, are having to make really difficult choices around, do I spend my money on transport money or do I buy healthy, nutritious foods? And I think South Africa is at a critical moment right now where if you are a child living in a household where you're not accessing or getting enough nutritious food, then that has a long-term impact on your development. So when we talk about issues like poor performance in our schools, when we're thinking about educational outcomes, or even when we're talking about productivity of our labor force, these are all interconnected. So I think for me, the big piece is that when we talk about food affordability and access to affordable foods in South Africa and the crisis that households are facing right now, is to also recognize the pivotal moment that we're in around the other knock-on impacts of households and especially children in the work that we do, where we're interested in understanding the impact that malnutrition has on the future generations of this country.
And I want to stay with what you're saying about, the families and the pressure that they're finding themselves under. Yes, part of the choice is transport, or do you put food on the table? But at the same time, one wonders then, what is on the table if the diet is not balanced?
Sure. And I think you're hitting on a critical and a lot of the work that we've been doing as the DG Murray Trust, but also alongside other stakeholders in civil society, is really calling for action. So we're saying to government, we know that there are a group of goods, or staple foods more precisely, that households regularly purchase, especially households that are lower income earning. And these goods are, and some of them are nutritious. This is what we're calling our 10 best buys. And this consists of a variety of goods. So for example, eggs, tin fish, peanut butter, and even amasi. But what we know is that for many households, because of the rising cost of food and inflation, a lot of these goods, even as their basic basket of goods that they would purchase on a monthly basis, are out of reach for many households. And what we're seeing then is that households are then making alternative choices. So they're going for foods that are cheaper, but these are not necessarily foods that are healthier or foods that actually are protein rich. So they're going for foods that will fill you up, but actually, especially in the case of children, don't necessarily aid your development. So what that means is that we're placing households really between a rock and a hard place. And what we're saying is, based on the research that we've done around some of these foods that are actually nutritious, if we make those more affordable, so these 10 best buys, households would be in a much better position to make better choices. And I think the thing is, and what we need to emphasize, is that individuals make choices based off of price. So if we can reduce the cost of that good, then that does influence the purchasing decisions that individuals are making when they walk into the store.
So, Kentse, one would then ask, especially those who are running businesses, they'll say, but we need to make profits and we need to be able to survive. So if we're now going to be dropping prices, we are then not going to be able to have sustainable businesses. So how are you proposing that this issue of the drop in prices then be done in a manner in which is going to be sustainable for both the businesses, but also at the same time for the consumers?
Sure. And I think the first thing that I do want to say that is critical is the long-term impact that this has. So earlier on, I was speaking about what is the long-term impact of children growing up in societies and in communities where they don't have access to nutritious food. What we know from research is that we lose billions as a country because of the long-term impact of stunting, for example, where we've seen in South Africa, 29% of children are stunted. This means that they're not getting enough nutrition to aid their development. So I think as society, and this is across the board, business, government, civil society, we should all be invested in thinking about how do we change the trajectory that we're on. We're a middle-income country where compared to other similar countries, we are performing much poorer when we're thinking about child outcomes, especially child outcomes and nutrition. So if I'm business, I can't just be thinking about what happens in the short term, so in the next 6 months or in the next year. To ensure the broader sustainability of our society, we have to recognize some of the risks that are present right now that are going to impact our growth. So what we're saying is, if government provides, and this is the proposal that we're putting to the table around what double discounting can look like, because we're saying to business, government will put in a retail subsidy targeting the 10 best buys. And what we're asking retailers to do is to then waive a markup on one no-name brand linked to those 10 best buys. So what that means is that if I'm an individual walking into a retail store, not only then do I have a choice of 10 goods that are nutritious and healthy, but I'm actually getting a much deeper discount than what we currently have. And these are staple foods that a majority of households, but especially poorer households, access across South Africa. So we're saying that this isn't just a business imperative. This is an imperative for all of us as South Africans, and we can tackle it by partnering government, business, and civil society.
Quite an interesting one. And when, we were in conversation with one expert from KwaZulu-Natal just a few weeks ago, who was also saying that, one other aspect of this conversation needs to also go towards indigenous foods, for example, to be able to ensure that people do also have access to these as well and not make them as expensive in some cases as they are right now.
No, absolutely. And I think in South Africa, we are in a privileged position where across the country, a lot of that history around what is healthy food, what is accessible food, we can elevate that. And I think that does include indigenous foods. And I think there's space for that in the 10 best buys that we're talking about here. Because ultimately, if we free up the money that people are spending on some of these staple foods, they will have an opportunity to actually spend it on other fresh goods that include a lot of indigenous foods that are accessible in their local area. So ultimately, I think, and maybe linked to that question, is that what this allows us to do is increase the purchasing power of households. And I think that's critical in a context where most households in South Africa are really caught in a tough situation and are needing us and government to intervene.
And Kentse, as you say, the tough situation, I mean, tonight we're learning about the petrol price about to go up again. And, households will be on tenterhooks by this because they're thinking about what does this mean then for their pockets. But thank you so much for getting us started on this conversation. Appreciate your time. That is Kentse Radebe, who is the Deputy CEO at DG Murray Trust.